I never thought a simple Saturday morning could change my life. I was standing in the middle of my property, rifle slung over my shoulder, the crisp autumn air biting at my cheeks, when I realized how much peace I'd taken for granted. The woods behind my house had always been mine, a quiet sanctuary where the noise of life faded, where the world narrowed down to the whisper of the wind through the trees and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. It was my escape, my therapy, my connection to something real. I had just finished a long week of paperwork and endless HOA emails when I decided to head out for a few hours. Hunting wasn't just a hobby for me. It was a way to clear my mind. And for years I had done it without incident. My neighbors never questioned it, and the HOA only existed as a bureaucratic annoyance. That morning, though, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like the world was holding its breath. I walked past the familiar ridge near the creek, scanning the woods, and that's when I noticed it, a small stack of papers pinned to a tree near my property line. My stomach sank before I even read them. The top sheet had the HOA's official seal and my name printed in bold. I ripped it free, hands trembling, and stared at the words that felt like a punch to the chest. Notice of violation. Unauthorized hunting on HOA property. I blinked, thinking it was a mistake. Unauthorized hunting? I whispered to myself, my voice echoing in the empty forest. I own this land, every inch of it. My hunting tags were current. My licenses were up to date. How could they possibly call this unauthorized? The next words hit me harder. You are hereby fined $500 and must cease all hunting activities immediately. I sank onto a nearby rock, my mind spinning. $500? That was petty. That was laughable. But it wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about control, about power, about a group of neighbors and self-appointed rule makers deciding I didn't belong. I had seen the signs for months. The whispers, the pointed looks during neighborhood barbecues, the little passive-aggressive notes left in mailboxes. Karen, the loudest voice in the HOA, always dressed immaculately, perfectly coiffed hair that never moved no matter the wind, had made it her mission to keep peace in the neighborhood. And apparently, peace meant controlling every move I made. I thought back to the meeting a few weeks ago. I had spoken calmly, rationally about hunting laws, boundaries, and property rights. Karen had crossed her arms, smirked, and said, "We have the right to maintain the atmosphere of our community." The others nodded politely, hiding their amusement behind their HOA-approved smiles. I had walked out that night furious, but I told myself I'd take the high road. I always did, but this was different. The fine wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration. They were officially trying to strip me of something that had been mine long before any of them arrived. And as I sat on that rock, the forest around me suddenly felt smaller, suffocating even. I realized that my anger was turning into something else, something sharp and steady, like a blade hidden beneath calm water. I thought about the trails. The ones Karen and her friends spent weekends hiking, laughing with their kids, snapping photos of every tree and rock as if the woods themselves belonged to them. Those trails cut right through my property line, but somehow no one ever questioned their use. No letters, no fines, no whispers of violating community standards. I watched them treat my land like it was theirs, all while I was punished for daring to enjoy it in my own way. I clenched my fists, trying to calm the fire building in my chest. I knew that reacting in the moment would only make things worse. But deep down, I also knew that I wasn't going to just let this go. Not quietly, not ever. There was a lesson to be learned here. Somewhere between the injustice and the quiet fury stirring in me, a plan was beginning to form. I gathered my things and walked back to the house, the weight of that letter pressing down like a storm cloud. I avoided my neighbors' eyes as I passed, but I could feel their subtle glances. They had already heard, of course. In a neighborhood like ours, news traveled faster than wildfire, and I realized with a chill creeping up my spine that this wasn't just about hunting. This was about respect, about fairness, about showing people that you can't walk over someone just because you have a title, a committee, or a sense of authority. That night, I sat in my living room staring at the ceiling. Replaying every interaction, every whispered comment, every smirk, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, I wouldn't be the same person who silently accepted fines and rules. The game had changed, and I had no intention of losing. The next morning, I woke with a restless energy I couldn't shake. The fine, the whispers, the smug satisfaction on Karen's face at the HOA meeting, they had all burrowed into my mind overnight. I brewed my coffee, staring out the kitchen window at the familiar ridge where the notice had been pinned. The woods seemed unchanged, serene as ever. Yet to me, they felt different now. They felt like a battlefield. I decided to walk the boundary lines just to see exactly what the HOA could claim and to remind myself that this was my land. As I moved along the edges, I noticed something I hadn't really thought about before: the trails Karen and her friends loved so much. They weren't public. They weren't officially part of the HOA. They cut across private parcels that had been owned for decades, some of them neglected or forgotten. And yet every weekend there they were, smiling, hiking, taking pictures, making memories on land that didn't belong to them. It hit me hard, the hypocrisy. They were punishing me for hunting, something I did with care, respect, and legal permission, yet they freely used land that belonged to someone else as if it were a park. Every laugh echoing through the woods felt like a challenge. Every cheerful shout felt like an insult. That evening, I confronted one of my neighbors while checking my fence line. I didn't plan to start an argument, I just wanted to see if anyone would even acknowledge that these trails were technically private. "Do you know whose land that trail actually cuts through?" I asked casually, pointing toward a cluster of hikers in the distance. The man looked at me, confused. I think it's HOA property, isn't it?" "No," I said, my voice low but firm. "It's private. Not mine, but still private." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing down the trail. "Oh, well, we just always thought that you could do whatever you wanted." I finished for him. He didn't answer, just shuffled away, embarrassed. It wasn't just the trail. It was the principle. It was the fact that a group of people who constantly preached rules and community standards felt entitled to everything that wasn't nailed down. But the moment I exercised my rights, they fined me. And Karen, she was at the center of it always. Her influence on the HOA was unmatched, and her sense of moral superiority was infuriating. Over the next few days, the tension began to escalate. Small things that once seemed minor now felt like provocations. A package left slightly askew on the curb, a lingering glare at the mailbox, whispered comments when I walked by the neighborhood playground. Every action was calculated, or so it felt, and each one reminded me that I was being watched, judged, and manipulated. Then came the email. An official HOA newsletter meant for all residents, but clearly aimed at me. They detailed acceptable recreational activities and community standards, including a vague reference to hunting. The language was pointed, condescending, and entirely unnecessary. Reading it made my blood boil. They weren't just punishing me. They were trying to shame me, make me feel like an outsider, make me doubt myself. I leaned back in my chair, gripping the arm so tightly that my knuckles whitened. I thought about all the weekends I'd spent quietly hunting, all the careful preparations, all the rules I had followed. And I thought about the trails, the families, the laughter, how the very same people who now condemned me were the ones enjoying privileges they had no right to. The fire in my chest was no longer just anger. It was a plan forming, subtle but unstoppable. I started thinking about leverage, about control, about how sometimes the only way to protect your freedom is to understand exactly what the other side relies on, and then quietly take it away. I began to investigate, piece by piece. Public records, property deeds, past sales. I traced the land that Karen and her friends used for hiking. It belonged to someone else, a couple who had inherited it years ago but never used it. The property was sitting, untended, forgotten, vulnerable. My pulse quickened as I realized the opportunity it presented. I could change the rules of this little game entirely. I could level the playing field, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with strategy. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just a victim of petty fines and hypocritical neighbors. I felt like I could actually win, but I also knew I had to be careful. Karen wasn't someone who would give up easily. The HOA was full of people who thrived on power and control. One wrong move and I could be painted as the villain. The stakes were higher than I had imagined. That night I sat on my porch, staring at the dark line of the woods. The only sound was the wind through the trees, and for the first time in days, it felt like an ally rather than a sanctuary. I allowed myself to imagine the possibilities. A world where my rights were respected, where hypocrisy couldn't walk through my land laughing, where I had the upper hand. The plan wasn't clear yet, but the seed had been planted. The battle was no longer about a $500 fine. It was about respect, power, and claiming what was mine, both legally and morally. And I would not rest until it was mine. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and I knew Karen would be there waiting for her moment. I almost didn't want to go, but ignoring it had never been an option. Sitting in the community hall, I could feel the air thick with that forced politeness that always masked the real tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, almost unforgiving glow. Karen walked in like she owned the place, heels clicking, perfectly pressed blazer, hair shining under the lights. She spotted me immediately, a smirk tugging at her lips, the kind of smirk that said, "I already have this in my pocket." The other board members murmured greetings, but their eyes flicked to me nervously. I realized that even among them, Karen's influence was stronger than most. The meeting began with routine announcements, landscaping schedules, pool maintenance, budget reports. My stomach twisted as they all went on, seemingly ignoring the real issue. Then came the inevitable moment. Karen's turn to speak. "I think we need to address the ongoing problem with hunting in the community," she said, her voice sharp, carrying across the room. She fixed me with a glare that could freeze blood. "Some residents are ignoring our rules, and it's unacceptable. We need to ensure everyone understands that the HOA has authority over how our land is used." I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to stand up and yell that she was wrong. Instead, I spoke carefully, measured, knowing that one misstep could make me the villain. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I hunt on my property. I have licenses, tags, and I follow the law. There's no violation here. The only problem is that you've decided to interpret your rules in a way that punishes me unfairly." A few murmurs ran through the room. Karen's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by a flash of annoyance. "The rules exist to protect the community, and your actions have consequences," she snapped. "Consequences?" I echoed, leaning slightly forward. "So it's acceptable for the community to freely use private land for hiking, but illegal for me to hunt on my own property? That's the kind of protection I'm questioning." There was silence. A tense, brittle silence, the kind that made every heartbeat feel loud. Karen's jaw tightened. "You're twisting facts," she said, her tone sharper now, almost venomous. But I wasn't finished. I leaned back, letting the weight of my words sink in. "No, Karen, you're twisting power. And you don't get to decide who can enjoy land that belongs to them and who can't. That's not protection. That's control." I could see her pulse in her temple, the small but telling sign that she hadn't expected resistance. Some board members exchanged glances, unsure where to look. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just speaking for myself. I was making a crack in her armor. After the meeting, things didn't calm down. They escalated. Notes appeared in my mailbox. Passive-aggressive, veiled threats about fines, complaints about noise, suspicious anonymous tips to the HOA claiming I was disturbing the peace. Karen had started a campaign behind the scenes, using every tool at her disposal to intimidate me, and yet every action she took only fueled the fire that had been building inside me. It was during one of these tense days that I learned something that changed everything. While reviewing public records on property lines, I discovered that the trails everyone claimed as public actually belonged to a couple who lived out of state. They hadn't maintained the land in years, hadn't visited in decades, and their property taxes were current but unpaid in terms of development. It was a forgotten parcel, sitting there like a secret waiting to be claimed. I felt a surge of possibility so strong it made my heart race. If I moved carefully, if I planned meticulously, I could take control of the very trails Karen and the others loved. I could shift the balance, level the playing field, and force them to feel the same helplessness I had felt. But I also knew this wouldn't be simple. Karen was relentless, and the HOA would fight me if they suspected anything. Any misstep, and I could be portrayed as a vindictive troublemaker, someone willing to manipulate for personal gain. The stakes were higher than ever, and the risk was intoxicating. That night, I walked my property again, rifle slung over my shoulder, not hunting this time, but surveying, planning. The woods were quiet, the moonlight slicing through the trees in silver streaks. I imagined Karen and her friends wandering down those trails, unaware that the land beneath their feet could soon be out of reach. The thought made me both anxious and exhilarated. I realized that this wasn't just about land or rules or fines anymore. It was personal. Karen's smugness, the neighborhood's hypocrisy, the constant undermining, they had turned something that should have been simple into a battle for dignity, respect, and power. And I couldn't back down. By the time I returned to my house, I had a plan beginning to take shape, a careful blueprint that would give me control without seeming aggressive, at least not yet. The war had shifted from words and fines to strategy, patience, and observation. I could feel the first true move of the game forming in my mind, and for the first time I knew exactly what victory might look like. For weeks, I stayed patient. Every time I saw Karen or the HOA members, I kept my composure, pretending to accept the fine and the judgment. I smiled politely at neighborhood events, nodded at casual greetings, and acted as if nothing had changed. But behind that calm exterior, my mind was working relentlessly, tracing every property line, double-checking deeds, and watching patterns of land use. Every step Karen and her friends took on those trails became a piece of the puzzle. Every weekend, their predictable schedules, their confidence that the trails were untouchable, it all became ammunition. And then it happened. The turning point. One Sunday morning, I received a call from a title company I had quietly contacted weeks before. The older couple who owned the land that made up the beloved trails had agreed to sell. The property, neglected for decades, was now mine. I felt my chest tighten as I held the phone, almost afraid to speak. My plan, which had been nothing more than a distant thought in the back of my mind, had suddenly become real. The trails Karen and the neighbors had used freely for years were legally and irreversibly under my control. The moment I hung up, a strange mix of triumph and anxiety settled in. I had imagined this scenario countless times, but imagining it and living it were two very different things. I thought about Karen's face when she discovered the change. I imagined the shock, the outrage, the disbelief, and I realized something terrifying. I had become exactly what she always warned the neighborhood about, a threat to their carefully constructed peace. That afternoon, I went to survey my new property. The land was wild, overgrown in places, and eerily quiet. I walked the trails, feeling the weight of ownership settle around me. Every step was a declaration. These woods were mine now. And with that ownership came a power I hadn't fully understood until that moment. The same trails that had felt like weapons against me were now instruments in my hands. By evening, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just sit on the land. I had to act to make the change visible, undeniable, and permanent. I ordered signs, gates, and locks. Every piece of equipment arrived within 2 days, and I spent hours installing them meticulously. By the end of the week, the familiar paths were blocked with large gates, clearly marked private property. No trespassing. The once cheerful trails were now silent, empty, and impenetrable. Then came the confrontation. Karen arrived that weekend, as expected, walking up to the gates with her usual entourage of neighbors. Their expressions shifted from confusion to fury as they realized the trails were closed. I watched from my porch as she tried to push the gates, shake the signs, even argue with me over the property lines. But I stood firm, calm, unyielding. "You can't do this," she yelled, her face flushed with anger. "This land has always been used by the community. It's tradition. You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, my voice steady. "It's private property. It always was, and now it's mine. You can no longer use it." The room, well, the small crowd that had gathered, fell silent. The smug superiority that Karen always carried vanished. replaced with disbelief. I could see it in her eyes. She had assumed control was hers by default. She had never expected resistance, let alone this decisive, irreversible move. Her anger quickly turned to desperation. "There must be some mistake. This can't happen." HOA rules. HOA rules don't override property ownership, I said simply. The law is clear, and so am I. These trails are closed, permanently. I didn't enjoy the confrontation, but I didn't flinch either. For the first time, I felt the satisfaction of taking control, of reclaiming what was mine. The air was thick with tension, every neighbor realizing that the balance of power had shifted. Karen's influence had limits, and she had just hit them. After she left, I walked along the trails again, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between the trees. The silence was profound, almost sacred. For years I had been pushed around, fined unfairly, and dismissed by a neighborhood that thought it could control me. But now I wasn't just defending myself, I had made a statement, and yet a part of me shivered with anticipation. Karen wouldn't take this lying down. The HOA wouldn't either. This victory was monumental, but it had also lit a fuse. I had changed the rules of the game, and I knew the next move from them would be swift, calculated, and personal. As I stood there, looking at the empty trails, I realized something important. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about respect. It was about teaching people that power without accountability is fragile. And it was about preparing for the storm I had inevitably unleashed. The calm of the woods around me felt temporary, almost deceptive. I knew the next chapter was coming, and when it arrived, nothing would be the same. Not for me, and certainly not for Karen. The morning after I closed the trails, the neighborhood felt different. I could sense it the moment I stepped outside. The usual chatter, laughter, and footsteps along the paths were gone. In their place was a tense silence, broken only by the distant hum of cars and the occasional bark of a dog. And then I saw her, Karen, standing at the edge of the blocked trail, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Her eyes met mine across the distance. And I knew immediately that this was the moment the war would either escalate or end. She wasn't coming over politely. She wasn't trying to reason. She was coming for confrontation, pure and unfiltered, and I felt a chill run down my spine. By the time I reached the gate, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, murmuring anxiously. Some looked shocked. Some looked thrilled. And some, like Karen, looked like their entire sense of order had been upended. "This is outrageous," Karen shouted, her voice cracking slightly from fury. "You can't just, this is our community. You're destroying it." "I'm not destroying anything," I said calmly, though my heart was pounding. "I'm enforcing the law. This land is private. Always was. Now it's mine. The trails are closed." Her eyes narrowed. "This isn't over. You think you can just buy land and block everyone? Everyone's going to hate you. The HOA will make you regret this." A laugh escaped me, sharp and bitter. "You think I care about their opinion? You fined me for living on my own property. You thought I'd take it silently, but not anymore. I own the land now. That gives me rights you can't touch." Her voice dropped, turning almost venomous. "You'll see this won't stand. People will fight you. You'll be forced to—" She never finished. I didn't need to wait for her outburst to end. I could see the shift in the neighbors' faces, the mixture of fear, shock, and curiosity. Some of them had been loyal to Karen for years, but now they were questioning everything. The rules, the authority, the power they had blindly trusted. Then, something unexpected happened. A young couple who had frequently used the trails approached me cautiously. We didn't realize it was private," the woman said, her voice trembling. "We never meant to disrespect anyone. We just—" "You didn't," I said softly, holding up a hand. "I'm not punishing anyone personally. This isn't about revenge. This is about fairness, about ownership, about realizing that boundaries matter." But Karen didn't stop. She stormed closer, red-faced, yelling so that everyone could hear. "This is petty. This is vindictive. You're making everyone miserable just to prove a point." I stood taller, meeting her fury with calm certainty. "Maybe I am proving a point. Maybe I am showing you what it feels like to be on the other side of unfair rules. And maybe I'm showing the rest of the neighborhood that power isn't theirs to take." The tension was unbearable. I could feel the heat of the confrontation, the weight of every eye watching. Then came the moment that shocked even me. Karen, in a fit of rage, grabbed the gate, shaking it violently, as if sheer force could undo what was legal and true. She yelled something so loud, so desperate, that the words echoed through the woods, and then it happened. Her grip slipped. The gate swung back slightly, and she stumbled, catching herself just in time against the metal. A hush fell over everyone. I realized in that instant that the confrontation had moved beyond words. It had become dangerous, physical, and unpredictable. I didn't move closer. I didn't want it to escalate further. But my chest tightened with adrenaline, fury, and a strange sense of triumph. I had faced the storm, and I had not flinched. I had stood my ground calmly, legally, and with unwavering resolve. After a long, tense minute, Karen finally stepped back, glaring at me, her face pale with shock and anger. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll pay for this." "I'll take my chances," I said quietly, almost to myself. The neighbors slowly dispersed, muttering among themselves. Some avoided my eyes, some whispered in disbelief, and a few glanced at me with what looked like a newfound respect. Karen left last, dragging her anger behind her like a storm cloud. Once the crowd cleared, I walked along the trails, touching the rough metal of the gates and the fresh, private property signs. The silence was profound, almost reverent. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what had happened. I had won in a way I hadn't fully imagined. But the victory was not without consequence. The adrenaline faded, leaving a quiet ache in my chest. I knew Karen would retaliate. I knew the HOA would try to find some loophole, some technicality, some way to challenge me. And I knew that the neighborhood would be divided, whispers spreading faster than the wind through the trees. Still, standing there, looking at the closed trails, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: power, control, and a fierce, unwavering sense of justice. I had faced the storm and emerged standing. And though I knew the fight wasn't truly over, I also knew that this moment, the confrontation, the shock, the triumph, was the turning point. I walked back to my house as the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods behind me quiet, obedient, and mine. Karen's threats hung in the air, but they no longer scared me. If anything, they strengthened my resolve. The war was far from finished, but for the first time, I felt like I was leading it. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood slowly adjusted to the new reality. The trails remained closed, the gates standing as silent sentinels, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace that wasn't forced, borrowed, or fleeting. The conflict with Karen and the HOA hadn't disappeared. They still whispered, still glanced, still tried to manipulate through emails and petty complaints, but their power over me had crumbled. The most surprising part was the change in the neighbors. Some avoided me, unsure of how to interact now that I had taken such decisive action. Others approached cautiously, almost sheepishly, as if to test whether I had softened or if my resolve would falter. A few even thanked me quietly, admitting that the hypocrisy they had ignored for years had finally been exposed. The balance of fear, respect, and curiosity hung in the air like a delicate tension, but it was mine to control. Karen, of course, was the hardest to read. She never apologized. She never admitted defeat. Instead, she fumed quietly, retreating from public interactions and throwing herself even more fiercely into HOA meetings, trying to regain influence. But the aura of inevitability that now surrounded me was impossible to shake. I could feel her calculating, planning, and waiting for another opportunity to strike. But I had learned that power was not just about aggression. It was about patience, strategy, and the courage to stand firm when others expected you to bend. For me, the lessons had been deeper than the victory itself. I had discovered something I hadn't realized before. Respect is earned, not demanded. Rules are important, but they are meaningless if applied unevenly. And sometimes, standing your ground requires more than anger. It requires clarity, foresight, and a willingness to act when the moment is right. One afternoon, I walked the closed trails alone. The woods were quiet, untouched by footsteps, yet alive with the same beauty that had drawn me here years ago. The crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound, and I allowed myself a small smile. I hadn't closed the trails to hurt anyone. I had closed them to reclaim fairness, to create boundaries where there had been none, and to show that integrity wasn't optional. As I stood at the highest ridge, looking down at the gates and signs, I reflected on the journey. The fine, the whispers, the smirks and condescension, all of it had been a catalyst, a spark that forced me to act, to think strategically, and to embrace the courage I hadn't known I possessed. Without that injustice, I might never have understood my own limits or realized the strength that came from calmly but firmly defending what was rightfully mine. I thought about Karen, about how easily she had assumed that her position and the weight of her influence made her untouchable. And I realized something critical. People who build walls of authority often forget that rules and power can be questioned, challenged, and ultimately redirected. That awareness was perhaps the most powerful tool I had gained from the entire experience. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. The trails stayed closed, the conflicts simmered in the background, and I focused on what truly mattered: my property, my peace, and my sense of self. Hunting, which had been the trigger for the entire ordeal, returned to its original purpose: a personal sanctuary, a way to connect with the land, and a reminder that freedom is something worth defending. And yet, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the neighborhood, the HOA, and Karen had all learned a lesson without a single aggressive confrontation. The gates stood as symbols not of revenge, but of justice and balance. I hadn't sought to humiliate anyone. I had sought to restore fairness, and in doing so, I had transformed the entire dynamic. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the woods glowed golden, I realized that the story of this conflict would stay with me forever, not as a tale of anger or resentment, but as a testament to what happens when someone refuses to be silenced, manipulated, or controlled. It wasn't about the fine, the trails, or the confrontation. It was about reclaiming my own voice, my own authority, and my own peace. The forest around me felt alive, patient, and enduring, much like the lesson I had learned. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. And sometimes, you have to take a stand quietly, decisively, and without hesitation to remind the world of both. As I walked back to my house, leaving the empty trails behind, I knew one thing for certain: the woods, the gates, and the signs were more than property markers. They were proof. Proof that patience, clarity, and courage could transform conflict into power, injustice into resolution, and fear into respect. And in that quiet, golden light, I felt the deepest satisfaction I had ever known, knowing that I had not only protected my land but reclaimed my own life.